If you do things the right way, in the right order, with the right intentions, it's not that hard. It's about as hard as making mac and cheese at the end of the day. Welcome to Cheshire Corners. I'm Kyle Obenberger, and I'll be your host as we trip through the looking glass. I'm one of the co-owners of Full Canopy LLC, a mycology supply, genetics, and consulting company based in Denver, Colorado. Today, I'll be taking you through a general overview of how to grow your own mushrooms, all the way from spore to harvesting your final canopy. So when you're working with mycelium, I think it's important to understand, what you're actually working with. The easiest way that I have to compare it is we're dikaryotic beings. You have a sperm, you have an egg cell. When they meet, that makes us dikaryotic. We stay that way our entire lives. Mushrooms are kind of unique to us in that they can be monokaryotic or dikaryotic. And when they're monokaryotic, that's the spores. That's what we're talking about. So when you work with spores, you're working with a whole bunch of basically, you got sperm and you got the egg. And when you're working with spores, you have a basically random chance. And you can increase this random chance by, working with the cultures over time, but you're not going to have an isolated culture when you work with spores. What we tend to work with is dikaryotic mycelium. We work with that, we put it on plates, we put it into liquid culture, we put it onto grain, and we work with it so that it has the favorable characteristics that we want for cultivation. An even canopy, a predictable harvest time, a high biological efficiency, a steady and consistent alkaloid profile, all things that we value as geneticists for the production of these full canopies that we're all so very proud of. So for the purpose of today, we're going to be talking more as using dikaryotic, isolated, cultured mycelium. So liquid culture that's already been tested, it's been run, it's gone through multiple generations to isolate and stabilize the genetics, either for production, phenotypic characteristics, potency, whatever it is that you're seeking. So when you're growing at home and you're using a culture rather than spores you can use. They just take longer, they're more random, it's going to be less consistent. So if you want to have a consistent result, working with an isolated liquid culture is your best bet. So the first step is getting culture. And then the next step would be attaining your spawn. And the spawn is going to be the food that the mycelium actually eats. So you're going to inject this grain spawn, or you're going to pour liquid culture on top of it. You can take an isolated agar plate, you can cut that agar plate up and put it into the grain bag. You can even take a grain bag of mycelium and take that grain and put it into another grain bag to inoculate it. But essentially what you're trying to do is take a clean, isolated culture that is free from bacteria or environmental contaminants and put it into a bag of food. And then you're going to have to wait until it consumes that food and fully colonizes the spawn. This can be done in a jar, it can be done in a bag. I've seen people in countries where they can't get their own fruiting bags, make their own grain bags and fruiting bags. I don't really recommend that because the failure rate is significantly higher, but where there's a will, there's a way when it comes to mycology. All you need are spores to make culture, and you need a clean environment in order to work in so that your spawn is going to produce a clean result. If you have environmental contaminants present, it's going to be harder. It's not going to be impossible. I'm not going to say it's impossible to get mycelium without a still air box or a laminar flow hood, but it's harder to get clean mycelium if you're doing everything the low-tech way. The easiest way, get behind a flow hood and inoculate your spawn. That's not the most accessible thing at home. Building a still air box is a little bit more reasonable, and even lower tech than that, you can get a syringe and a candle and just inject a grain spawn bag. But the goal with the spawn is to get a fully colonized bag of food that the mycelium can eat, fully colonized, and then you take that and you put it into bulk substrate. Substrate is something that we could talk about for, hours. So for the purposes of today, we're going to talk about cubensis. We're not going to talk about gourmet substrate. We're not going to talk about exotic substrates. Cubensis tends to prefer substrate with a cocoa vermiculite gypsum base. CVG is what we call it in the industry. You can add things to CVG, you can subtract things from CVG. You can grow straight on cocoa if you wanted to. You can grow straight on horse manure if you want to. That being said, CVG is probably the easiest thing for people to attain or make at home, and cubensis doesn't have a problem growing on it. So what you're gonna do with your CVG substrate is you're going to take your grain spawn and you're going to introduce your grain spawn to the substrate. So there's two very common methods that people cultivate mushrooms today. It's in bag or in a tub, and they call these monotubs. They have holes on them with filtered patches to allow airflow. That airflow allows the substrate to actually dehydrate, and dehydration is probably the number one pinning trigger. So the substrate actually losing its moisture is similar in nature to when it rains. So when it rains and then it starts to dry up, that's a signal to mushrooms, hey, now is a good time to drop your spores. Now is a good time to make fruiting bodies, develop them, and try to drop your spores. That's a topic for another day, because you can work things to not drop spores when it comes to genetics. So there are a lot of things that don't actually drop spores, but that's the goal with mushrooms. They want to reproduce. So you put your inoculated grain spawn into sterilized or pasteurized substrate. You try to do this as cleanly as possible. If you got rubber gloves and some isopropyl alcohol, a mask to wear, you're probably good to go. I do mine in front of a flow hood because why take chances? If you can do it in a sterile environment, better. It's going to take about anywhere from like 7 to 21 days for your substrate to fully colonize. And for your grain to colonize, I forgot to mention that, it's going to take about anywhere from 7 to 21 days. So it really depends on how you're inoculating it. If you're doing agar, if you're doing LC, if you're doing grain to grain, it can be faster than that, it can be slower than that. But generally speaking, you're going to be looking at a window of 1 to 3 weeks. And then when you go bulk to sub, you take your bulk colonized spawn and you put it into substrate. You're going to wait about a week to 3 weeks depending on the variety for full colonization. Some, like Enigma, might take 2 months to fully fruit and finish their cycle for one harvest. But generally speaking, when you go grain into substrate, you're going to have your first harvest anywhere from 2 to 5 weeks. And it really depends on genetics, really depends on environment. If you're doing a grain ratio that's closer to 1-to-1, you're going to get faster fruit. Probably going to get less fruit, but you are going to get faster fruit. If you do higher ratios, you might get more fruit. Like we tend to do a 3-to-1 ratio. So if I was making a 16-pound tub with 4 pounds of grain spawn, I would use 12 pounds of substrate in that mixture. This would be like a 54 or 66 quart tub, but you only want to have a few inches of height when you're doing it in a tub. In my experience, I've tried deeper tubs. It's not the best thing for biological efficiency. When it comes to bag tech, you have a lot more room to work with. I know people who run 2-pound bags, I know people who run 4-pound bags, I know people who run 12-pound bags. I run 8-pound bags. I do 6 pounds of sub, 2 pounds of grain. But when you mix your sub and your grain together, you're just going to let that sit and colonize. And then as it fully colonizes, if you have your inputs dialed in, if you have your water in the substrate dialed in, you should get a pretty good canopy. And it's highly dependent on the genetics, the inputs, and the environments that those inputs are in. So even the amount of CO2 that you have in the room can change the type of canopy development that you get. That being said, when you're harvesting, you're going to try to be as gentle with that substrate as possible if you plan to get subsequent flushes. I do more growing for genetic development than any other type of growing, so I one flush most of my things. That is done simply because that's the easiest way for me to gauge the biological efficiency and the performance of it and still get a new thing in to replace it and get more data, because we try to be as above board as possible as we are here. Prop 122 is a brand new playground, but We don't want to be doing too much work where we're not being compliant, but we want to be doing enough that we're on top of the game. And one flushing is the easiest way for me to get more data. People at home might do multiple flushes. If you're going to do multiple flushes, there's multiple ways you can go about it. Some people will dunk their tub. Some people will fill their bags up with water. I'm actually here to advise against that. I've taken a lot of data on dunking. If you take, say, a 6-pound block or a 4-pound block and you dunk it underwater for 24 hours, the mycelium, as it consolidates, gets more hydrophobic. So as it gets more colonized and more consolidated over time, which it's going to do with subsequent flushes, it's going to intake less water as you dunk it. So if you're going for multiple flushes at home, wetter is better when you make the substrate to begin with. We live in a very arid environment here in Colorado, so the sub that we make here might be a little bit wetter than the sub that you're making on, say, the East Coast, or closer to sea level, where you've got more atmospheric pressure. But the best way that you can guarantee a good flush and good results, have dialed in inputs going into either your bag or your tub, either making them yourself through a trusted methodology or purchasing them from a trusted vendor, whether local or online. Reputation goes a long way in this industry. Making sure that you follow the correct steps in the correct order. Like, I just had a customer today saying they just put agar plates in a substrate and they somehow got mushrooms. It's not how you're supposed to do it, but if you follow the correct steps, you should have the correct results that you're looking for. You want to go with getting good isolated genetics. You want to take those isolated genetics, put them into sterile grain spawn. You want to take that grain spawn, put it into sub, let that fully colonize, and then you should have a canopy to harvest in 3 to 5 weeks time, depending on variety. Enigma, you might be looking at a couple months. But you'll hear a lot of people say that this is really difficult, expect a lot of failure. If you do things the right way, in the right order, with the right intentions, and you don't consume the wrong information and how to do that, it's not that hard. It's about as hard as making mac and cheese at the end of the day.